Well, hi. It's my live video, and I'm a little bit late because I had to change browsers because my original browser just wouldn't let me do this. So I needed to go and change browsers, and that took me 4 minutes to do. So I am here, and I'm glad to see some of you are joining me. So let me just recap what led to the, and I am sorry about the light, but the window behind me is kind of bright. Let me try this. No, that's worse. Okay, let me recap what this is all about. I got an invitation from somebody who said that they had a brand new reading program happening in Bellingham, and somebody gave them my information, so would I like to join in? So I said, sure, and a couple of emails exchanged later. What happened was that I happened to mention a dirty word. I said, what kind of reading would you like? And you do realize I write basically fantasy, so kind of shocked silence later, I got back an email saying, we're so terribly sorry, but this is sponsored by our academic professor and our academic department, and his rules are only literature, so we can't have fantasy there. So I got more or less disinvited from there. So I wrote a bit of it on Facebook, and everybody else decided that was just as bad an idea as I thought it was. So I thought I would do my own reading and welcome everybody. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about this brand new project that I'm working on. And let me go back a little bit on that. There's a friend of mine here on Facebook whom I'm still hoping is going to turn up, but if he does, I will point him out gleefully, who has a habit of egging me on with story ideas. He thinks that I should write this, I should write that, I should write something else. He's been instrumental in at least one thing that I've published, the twice promised novella, which you can find on Amazon if you look for it. So he came up with this idea that he wanted to see me write, and it involved different elements, which included retired superhero grannies who knitted and their orderly sidekicks. And I kind of took it and ran with it, wrote the story. Some of you may have read it. I posted it on my Patreon at some point in the open for public consumption, not just for my patrons. And it's called Val Hall. Val Hall turns out to be a retirement home for retired superheroes, third class. This is what happens to superheroes when they stop being active in their field. And they basically get gathered into this home. So this entire story got centered around this Val Hall place. I wrote one story, and then my beloved husband weighs in and said, this is a great idea, you should write more about this. And I said, nope. And he said, yep. And so I kind of thought about this, and as good ideas do, this one grew like Topsy. Right now, I have this project, which is turning out to be 2 different books. Val Hall, the even years, Val Hall, the odd years. And each book is a collection of some 8 or 9 stories which cover a century of Val Hall from its inception to now. And different stories are linked to different historical moments, to different historical times. So far, I've written a suffragette story. I've written a civil rights story. I've written a story about atomic bombs in Hiroshima. I've written all these the big historical picture with a superhero that is involved in there. And it turns out that this is much bigger than I ever thought it was going to be. And it's an amazing project. And some of the stories that are coming out of this are absolutely mind-blowing to me. And I'm the one who's writing them. So what I thought I would do, for those of you who want to hang on for this long, I'm going to give you, because I think this is important, I'm going to give you 2 stories. I'm going to read you the story which is the overture, which is the one about the founding, which actually takes place in 1918, and which introduces to you the superhero who is known as the Origami Man for a good reason, because the man who inspired it, I don't know if you can see this, but this is an origami dragon, which is actually breathing fire. And this is an amazing piece, which was done in front of me by this amazingly talented guy, who ended up being part of this story as the Origami Man. So I'm going to read you that, and it's relatively short for a story. And then I'm going to give you an idea about what I'm doing, and I'm going to read you a story which is rooted in 1935 in the Dust Bowl. And my superhero is involved in that. So without further ado, I will start reading. If I can just go back to my... Okay, the one about the founding, 1918. The fire in the grate was the only light in the dark room, casting orange flickers and dancing shadows at the man who sat in an armchair close to the hearth, with a pile of carefully cut paper beside him on a small table. There was a hand-crocheted Afghan rug, a dark red, almost black in the firelight, thrown over his knees, and he wore a dressing gown of a fairly heavy-duty, good quality silk over a pair of flannel pajamas. His feet, hidden under the rug, were bare and thrust into a pair of sheepskin-lined slippers. On top of the rug, almost automatically, almost without paying any attention to what he was doing at all, the man's hands were busy folding a piece of paper from that pile beside him into an intricate origami animal. His eyes only occasionally strayed to the work that his hands were doing. Mostly they stayed on the fire, unfocused, and it was obvious that his mind's eye was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away. Somewhere that made him unhappy at that, because every now and then he would shudder, or his shoulders would rise to hunch up about his ears, and he'd blink once or twice, rapidly, furiously, as though he had just woken up from a dream or a nightmare. But he would slip back into the same dream almost immediately, his only barely stilled hands back at his work. Behind him, in the corner of the room, the firelight picked out the tinsel glittering on a small but proud Christmas tree, decked with ornaments that were part elaborate Victorian glass globes, and part strange wild pagan things that didn't look like they had any business on something that was reared up as part of a Christian festival. It looked perhaps strange, but not to someone who knew the man whose room this was, whose tree this was. It was perfectly understandable to such a someone. Like the second man who opened the door into the room and slipped inside, wrapped in his own somewhat more homely version of a thick dressing gown. The second man wore a luxuriant moustache and frankly boastful sideburns of a rich ginger hue. He boasted a lanky frame with long, thin legs poking out from underneath the hem of the dressing gown, and one of his arms hung at an odd, useless angle by his side, his hand curved into the beginning of a loose fist. It was clear he had no control over that hand. "Have you been to bed at all, Tim?" the red-haired man asked gently, slipping uninvited into a second armchair by the fire. "No," said the man addressed as Tim, tearing his eyes from the fire, his gaze softening slightly as it landed on his companion. "I thought you were long since asleep, Matthew." "I was. Something woke me." "I haven't made any noise," Tim said. "Perhaps it was the silence," Matthew said, yawning. "What is it? You can't wait until Christmas Day, like a child?" "I'm a pagan, boy, not any kind of a Christian soul. I have never really kept Christmas in the manner you describe. Maybe when I was really small, hiding behind my mother's skirts, but not since I have known who my true father was. It seemed kind of disrespectful to celebrate with such pomp and circumstance the advent of a new god, the one that supplanted my own father and his family in the minds and temples of men. Would have seemed like an act of repudiation almost. I have never wished to do anything that might be interpreted as that. I'm actually not unproud of the fact that I come from the loins of Odin himself, even if I was just an illegitimate byblow, gotten a mortal woman, even if I was maybe no more than an impulse, a moment of play, something that was barely remembered at all and perhaps only thought about with regret. It happened. I'm here, but I'm hardly a Christian in any sense." "But yet, the tree," Matthew said, smiling. Tim shrugged. "I like Christmas trees. I like the gourd of it, the joy. One can put one up without any other ulterior motive than that." His hands completed a final fold and lifted, From beneath them, an origami paper bird of paradise or some such creature with a long trailing tail sat quiescent for a moment and then stirred, lifted its wings, rose from Tim's lap, and flew up into a shadowed corner of the room. Another of its kind, its life spark spent, lay there already in a pile of dingy, unraveling paper. The origami creatures that arose from Tim's paper squares had the gift of life from his hands, but the span of it was brief. Some of them lasted a day or two, others not even that. Matthew picked up their sad little corpses from the floor dutifully every day and removed them. Somebody had to. Tim didn't appear to notice them, and he kept making more. The room would have been buried in a paper creatures in short order if the defunct ones were not whisked away before they became a problem. Tim reached out for another paper square. "So what is it then?" Matthew asked, glancing back at the tree. "It's been years," Tim said softly, "since I've come to this day and not remembered. 1914. Granted, not many years. It's only 4 years ago, and it seems like it was another lifetime altogether. I almost can't believe that I was there, that it really happened, that it wasn't just one nice moment of dream before the hell that had been and the hell that was yet to come." "It happened," Matthew said. "I was there too." Under Tim's fingers, a flat square of paper began to assume a three-dimensional form. "Stille Nacht," they sang. "Silent night." Yes, I knew they were German words. They had not occurred to me. When I heard them there in those trenches, it was like, I don't know how to tell you this. "I understand," Matthew said. "I do. But does the Christmas truce mean that you have to hold vigil in its memory ever after?" "Sleep, at least on this night, was a gift I left for whoever eventually found it in the blood and the mud of the trenches," Tim said, his eyes in his hands, "if it isn't still buried there." "Christmas gifts are a Christian thing," Matthew said, smiling ruefully. "Gifts are a human thing," Tim said. "They predate the Christian God. I can give gifts where I choose." "When was the last time someone gave a gift to you, my friend?" Matthew asked. "I could put the kettle on for some tea, but it's a pretty self-serving gesture, since I would probably need you to bring the 2 cups in here." Under Tim's hands, a small origami dragon flapped its intricate wings twice, lifted off Tim's lap, burped an apologetic spark of a small experimental blue-tinged blaze, and tumbled ungracefully into the flames of the hearth, even as its own unwise breath lit one of its own wings on fire. He reached for another paper. The first few folds were, as usual, random-looking, but Matthew, who was fascinated by Tim's gift, tried to discern what was coming. A cat? A frog? "No tea for me, thank you," Tim said, folding. "But if you want to look at it that way, tonight might be a sort of gift. It's over, Matthew. It's over. That is hard to believe now. I don't think we will ever know the full impact of it until the history books have been written and the pencil pushers have had a chance to look it all up. But from what I know now, in just 6 campaigns, in the last 3.5 years, we have lost 5 million men in battle, for reasons that nobody alive could possibly explain to you and make sense of any of it. And that isn't counting the millions who died of disease or of stupid accidents or as prisoners locked up somewhere and hoping for a reprieve that never came. And even that is ignoring the civilian deaths. The whole thing is still too close to those of us who lived through it. But my friend, trust me when I tell you that 100 years from now they will remember the names of Passchendaele or the Somme or Verdun and everything that went with them." He glanced up from the thing taking shape in his lap into the fire up at his friend's face. A ghost of a smile played about his mouth. "And there would have been more, except for your gift, Matthew." Matthew made a dismissive gesture with his good hand. "I did very little." "On the scale on which I was speaking, perhaps," Tim said. "But there, on the ground, every set of bones mattered, and not a few of them owe their lives to you and to that extraordinary superhero ability you own, bulletproof man. If I had not seen it happen before my eyes, I would have thought delirious people who were about to die were making the whole story up from whole cloth. But I saw you. I saw you walk out there, and the bullets simply veer away from you like they had hit an invisible wall. From you and from the wounded men you brought back to safety and to life." "They will think it was just seeing things," Matthew said. "Perhaps it's just as well." He lifted his dead arm in a despondent way. "In the end, they get you anyway." "You picked up a live grenade to throw out of the trench," Tim said. "That thing got inside that shield of yours. It could have been worse. It didn't blow up in your hand. It only exploded as you tossed it. You still have all your fingers in your arm." "Little use it is," Matthew said a little savagely. "So, now, peace is here. What is a crippled superhero, if you insist on applying that label, to do with his life? I'm not yet 30 years old, Timothy Dunn. I'm hardly ready for the scrap heap. These should be the best years of my life. I should be putting together a future, starting a family. What woman would have A woman took my one-eyed father and made me, Tim said equably. The thing in his hands was turning into a lizard-like object, humped in the middle, and he was just folding a curl into its tail. You're not something to waste. The world owes you, even if it doesn't know how to compute the debt. It owes so many people whom it doesn't know how to appreciate. The heroes, the superheroes. Like you, Origami Man, Matthew said, nodding at the creature from whom Tim's hands had just lifted. The paper chameleon rose to all four legs, arched its back into a deeper hump, and began to shade into the burgundy of the Afghan on Tim's lap. Before long, he was almost completely camouflaged. The bit of burgundy chameleon-shaped shadow slipped from Tim's lap and down onto the carpet, where it was briefly evident, a burgundy-colored smear, before it took on the color of the floor and disappeared again. Matthew could hear paper rustle as it scurried invisibly away. Tim reached for another paper. It hardly compares, he said equably. This little talent is icing on the top. Look, there are those whom humans perceive as superheroes of the first class, like my half-brother Thor and his hammer, for instance. Those, they don't need anything or anybody. Their immortal lives are already written. They do things that mere humans could never or sometimes even understand. Their places in Valhalla is already saved for whenever they decide to retire to that hole, and there is nothing that could happen in the intervening period to make any difference in that fate. They have no secret identities to hide their own. They don't see a need to hide. When they appear and when they do things, they're just being themselves in the only way they know how. They're superheroes of the first class. They can't help it. They're born to be that. They're immortals. They're gods. And when you have the only slightly lesser kind, the kind whose names you know, but who have a mask they wear while out amongst the ordinary people, the ones with real power, which might come from any number of places, but humans, not gods. And they'll be fine too, because they accrete fame and adulation, and they will either die in a blaze of glory performing some deed of which songs are then sung, or they will die when ancient in years in their beds hung with cloth of gold and their descendants weeping around them, leaving a legacy of their memory and their name. You might call them, without being demeaning about it, superheroes, second class. And then there are folks like you, people who do something purely astonishing, and then other people refuse to believe whether they've seen it, or they simply forget. Superheroes, third class, Matthew said with a shade of bitterness. Nothing inherently wrong with that. It's a classification, Tim said. But the real question is, who is left to care for and treasure the superhero third class? What happens to men who are impervious to bullets when the war stops and the bullets stop flying? I know. It isn't as though I was something magnificent waiting to happen before the war. I was ordinary enough. You were never ordinary, Tim murmured. So what are you? Matthew asked. Look at you, making creatures of dead paper and watching them fly and creep and scuttle away alive when you're done, Origami Man. That's the kind of name you just gave me. It covers the single gift in a superhero's power. What does that make you? Are you like me, or do you claim godhood? Hardly, Tim said. Illegitimate byblow, remember? That doesn't entitle me to a legacy, but I do carry immortal blood, there's that. Otherwise, I'm as third class of a superhero as you are. He folded a corner of the paper into a winged edge of a half-formed bird. I just have a few options, as it were, but I'm not about to lean on any of them too hard and expect them to support my weight. I may not be much in physical form. Put me and Thor side by side and you would laugh, but our father is still too proud to let any of his children go hungry. I will never do that, whatever I do. I won't starve. He looked up briefly. And neither will you, my friend, so long as you stay close to me. I can't even bring you a cup of tea, Matthew said morosely. Of what use am I? You might as well fold me up and tuck me away in an asylum somewhere and tell them that the war made me crazy and let them try and take care of me. You don't want anyone to think you are crazy, Tim said. You may think you are making a joke, but those dark places in which they lock away those whom they believe have lost their faculties, that is no laughing matter at all. If any of your superheroes, third class, are identified, that's where they'll end up, probably, Matthew prophesied grimly. If only because the stories they tell, the stories that are told about them, are so palpably impossible and therefore have to be the product of a deranged mind. I know what happened to me out there in no man's land with bullets flying around me like angry hornets and not one of them coming close enough to touch me. I could barely believe it myself when it was happening to me at the time. Now let someone who merely saw it happen try and convince anybody that it is real, that it could be true. There could be a whole lot of us sharing space in the asylum if we insist. But we know it's true, Tim said. The paper square was transforming into a bird, and the bird's beak was open, and Matthew swore he could hear the ghost of birdsong. So it is true, and it cannot be sorry about that, and it cannot be made untrue by mere disbelief. Perhaps the only entity who could believe it unreservedly is just another superhero, Matthew said, closing his eyes. Tim sat up. His fingers clenched spasmodically, bending a wing, and there was a protesting squawk from the half-made bird. That's it, he said. That's it? That's what? What are you talking about? Matthew asked, rousing. Tim threw a murmured word of apology towards his lap, corrected the wing, and then looked up again. His eyes were glittering in the firelight. Valhalla, he said. Valhalla? What of it? You already said that only the ones who... Not Valhalla, not my father's halls. We won't thrust the mortals upon him in any number, not in that place. But there could be another place for them out here. A place for those who are like us, like you. A place where heroes could go and find care and welcome. A place where they would be believed. A place where they belonged, right here in this, their own world, without leaving it for the halls of the gods or taking their immortal souls in hand and braving a crossing into the darkness in which they know not what awaits them. A place where they could let down their eternal guard, even when they no longer have access to that gift that once made them into a superhero. Maybe especially then. A place of peace to retire to and close their eyes and know that they would be safe. Not Valhalla, Valhalla. A home for retired superheroes, third class. Tim, there is no such place, Matthew said. It is a new world that we've just made, Tim said, making the final fold, opening his hands, letting the dove that he had made flutter paper wings and rise up towards the shadows of the ceiling. Anything can exist in this new world. Some things must exist in it. Valhalla will exist. I will make it exist. I will fold a house of peace out of paper if I have to, except that this one will live longer than my ephemera usually do. I will make sure of that, and it will be a sanctuary. Matthew, taking all of this only half seriously until now, sat up and stared at the other man intensely. You really mean this, he said. I vow it, Tim said simply. It will still be a gift that you are giving to others, Matthew said, to the world, to those like us in the world, if you like. You're still giving, Tim. You're still giving. Tim reached out a hand for another sheet of paper, hesitated, and then returned it to his lap briefly, where his fingers interlocked for a moment. When the lacing released and Tim lifted the rug from his lap with one hand, pushing himself out of his armchair with the other. No, my friend. It might look like it, but I'm taking that gift to myself right now. I have made this promise and I will make it live, and because of that I am now abandoning yet another sleepless Christmas Eve, and I'm going to my bed. I do believe that I can sleep now. Maybe, if the gods are kind, even dream. He smiled, letting the rug drop to the armchair. The world is so weary of war, he said, not least myself. But I can have a hand in building just a sliver of the peace that is to come. I will gather them when they have no place to go. I will listen to their stories and the accounts of their deeds and the things that they have accomplished with the strength of their gifts, which are human-sized, but no less magnificent for all that, and I will make them and their stories live and endure. They will be my gift, Matthew, those who cross Valhalla's threshold, and I cannot wait to meet them. That is the foundation of Valhalla. My friend Tim Dunn, who's a real person, and there's a real origami man. Like I said, remember this, he folded this in front of my eyes. This is a dragon breathing fire. This was a piece of paper. He gave me the germ, he gave me the piece of grit that became the pearl, and I made him create Valhalla. He was the foundation of Valhalla. And if you pick up on the superhero's third class, this is what happens when a human being with a single, solid, magnificent gift becomes a superhero in acting with that gift. So I'm going to give you one of the stories, the one about the dust dragon, dateline 1935. Valhalla 2017. Does everybody have their glasses? No, Mr. Williams, your prescription sunglasses aren't going to cut it. Eddie, could you pass on Eddie gathered up a spare pair of eclipse glasses, folding the garish eclipse-printed cardboard frames into shape as he did so, and trotted over to where a Valhall resident waited with a smile, having pushed his own spectacles up onto the top of his head. He received the eclipse glasses, put them on, and craned his neck up into the sky from the wicker chair in which he was sitting, exclaiming on how his view of the heavens suddenly changed. Eddie paused to exchange a word and a smile with another resident or two, making sure everyone on the Valhall lawn was okay, and paused by one woman who stood a little apart from the others. She was a striking figure, a smidge taller than Eddie himself, with a long, bony, angular frame, an angular face that seemed to be all chin and cheekbones. Her thinning iron-grey hair, which looked not so much like it had naturally aged, but more as though colour had been sandpapered from it, leaving only a hint of the fact that it had once had a different shade and texture, was loose and straggly, spilling over his shoulders. There was something about her, something craggy and wind-scoured. She called to mind one of those once fabulous stately homes which had been abandoned to the mercies of the elements, and still carried hints of their former glory, a memory of grandeur, if you like, if you didn't look too closely at the crumbling ruins of the edges. The woman wasn't looking up at the sky like everybody else, but gazed out over the ocean towards the horizon, her eclipse glasses dangling from one hand at her side. "Everything all right, Miss Miller?" Mary Miller, better known as the Shield when she was young, turned her head marginally and smiled. "Yes, I'm fine." "You seen the sun go out before?" Eddie asked, lingering beside her, instincts engaged. "I was in Alaska for the 1963 eclipse in July," Mary said. "I was, 40? Something like that. A whole group of us went up there to see. Full totality that time. I regretted it. I was afraid. It reminded me too much of... It wasn't pleasant." "We won't get that here, not today," Eddie said, trying to sound reassuring. "I think I read somewhere that we're getting 80%, something like that." Mary nodded. "I know, and to tell you the truth, I'm just as glad for it. Because there are lots of ways the sun can go out. I was just a kid back in Oklahoma when the dusters came calling and blotted out the sky. I remember them well, the grit and the darkness. Those were that first triggered me, you know. Back in the day, I was only 12 on Black Sunday." She narrowed her eyes briefly, squinting the sunlight spilling out over the ocean. "That's where it all began, you know. That's where it began, with the dust dragon." Oklahoma, 1935. Bessie Miller flung the sash window up and leaned outside, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. "Well, did you ever see a more beautiful day?" she said brightly. Mary and little Joe squirmed up to the window beside her and poked their own heads out, craning their necks to look at the most perfect blue sky they could remember. The air was still and smelled of April. Behind them in the kitchen, Mary's older sisters, Louisa and Laurie, who had not yet left the table, lifted their heads and smiled. Even the baby, known to everyone as Sweet Johnny, gurgled happily from his basket in the far corner. "Your pa just went out to check on the cow," Bessie said, turning back into the room and reaching out to pull the tie of her apron. "Hurry up and wash your faces. Louisa, get a clean pinny on. Let's get to church and give thanks to the Lord for this day, and then maybe we can all go out and have a picnic lunch somewhere. The good Lord above knows we deserve it. Who let that dog in? Get, Mr. Hound. Shoo! Out the back with you. Get a move on, girls. I'll go get your pa to get the trap ready and the mule hitched." "Do we need to bring the masks, Ma?" Louisa asked, turning back on her way out the kitchen. "Lord be with you, child. Look outside. What do you need the mask for today? For once we have no dust swirling in the wind. Enjoy it. In fact," Bessie turned back to peer out the window again into the sunshine pouring down from the bright, blessed blue sky. She hesitated, but then nodded to herself, making a decision. "In fact, it's high time this house was aired out properly," she said firmly. "Louisa, open the bedroom window when you go up there. Laurie, get the parlor window open, just enough for some air to get in. This house has been shut up for so long it'll do good to get a breath of God's sweet air in it. By the time we get back from church, this place will smell like heaven again. Get a move on, girls. We need to make tracks. Mary, drag a comb through your hair, would you? There isn't a breath of wind out there, and your hair looks like you've been dragged backwards through a haystack in a gale. Joe, you come with me." She paused only briefly enough to gather up Sweet Johnny into the crook of her arm, tuck a stray corner of his blanket around him, and then swept out through the back door of the kitchen into the yard, leaving her girls to do her bidding and make themselves presentable for church. The whole family was ready to go, with abortive stabs to corral wandering children in the space of the next 10 minutes or so, while the sun still shone down tenderly from a clear blue sky. Two of their neighbors, the Jamisons next door and the Wingers, 2 farms down from them, owned motor cars, jalopies both to be sure, and there was always talk and complaints about how them monsters were throwing oil or having trouble with transmissions. Pa Miller didn't hold with such things. Not yet, anyway. He'd said, rubbing his chin with his hand as he was wont to do and making oracular pronouncements, that he could see more and more folks go in for them car things, but so far as he was concerned, no mule ever had trouble with its transmission. It was the Miller mule hitched to the family wagon that waited ready for the Millers to travel to church that Sunday, and Pa Miller would make no apologies for that. At church, people gathering for the Palm Sunday service smiled at one another as they passed by. There was more than enough. Nobody wanted to turn the weather by making a direct comment on it, but the pure, sweet joy of the spring morning was more than enough to be communicated without words. Even the sermon was upbeat for a change, talking about God's glory and mercy rather than thundering about his punishment for the sins of the cowering congregation. The minister stood in the pulpit sturdily saying that with a few more days like this one and a couple of good rains when they were needed would make the plains bloom with the blessings of the Lord. The congregation nodded in emphatic agreement. When the service was over, they all poured out into the sunshine again, ready to offer further worship unto the Lord under his flawless blue sky and the warm sunshine pouring from the heavens. It almost feels like summer's coming, Pa Miller said, taking off his good jacket and rolling up his shirt sleeves as he picked up the mule's reins again. It's got to be pushing 70 out here in the sun. Let's have a picnic, Bessie said. I threw the rye bread into the basket and the rest of the cheese wheel, and I even put in the last bottle of that cider from last year. Kids, no sneaking into the basket until I say so, do you hear me? Let's leave the house to air out a little more, and it'll all be wonderful when we get home. And in the meantime, let's celebrate. They were all in that kind of mood, a celebratory, it'll all be fine, glorious, happy mood. The girls and Joe curled up in the back of the wagon, eyeing the picnic basket. Bessie sat proudly in the front bench beside her handsome husband with sweet Johnny in her arms and her best church bonnet on, and felt as though the world could not possibly be any more wonderful. Mary did not want to be the one to be the misery of the day, but something inside of her was ticking, like a clock winding down. There was nothing to see, nothing to hint at anything other than just general contentment and well-being. Her siblings were chattering and giggling and eagerly anticipating the picnic to come, but she sat back in a corner of the wagon with her feet curled up under her and watched the sky. The sky had no message for her. It remained blue and clear, the sun remained warm. And yet. She was to remember that picnic in the years to come. It was a pure, small oasis of calm. It had almost been enough to lull her premonitions, almost enough to make her laugh with her sisters when she was teased about being such a gloomy goose on such a fine day. Almost enough for her still to be smiling as the wagon rolled back into their yard, and Louisa and Laurie and Joe followed Bessie and the baby into the house. Pa went about unhitching the mule and setting the animal back in its stall, while the dog, evicted once more from the kitchen by the business end of Bessie's broom, gamboled about his feet. But Mary had paused to look out over the horizon, and there was a haze there. Nothing specific, nothing remotely threatening, but it was something that made Mary twitch, the tiny hairs on her arms standing to attention. Pa, she began, and her father looked around. What is it, Mary? Mary hesitated, stole another look. It wasn't anything she could nail down, offer any kind of specific presentiment about, anything she could explain without sounding like whining and complaining on a day when everyone else was so very happy with life. Nothing, Pa, she said quietly. Nothing. But it was something. Within a couple of hours, the wind had started to pick up again, stirring up the dust once more to the point where Bessie reluctantly gave orders for the windows to be closed. The sun was still out, but the day somehow got darker, and the haze on the horizon had grown to the point that even Pa had noticed it and frowned in its direction. Something was on its way. Mary, her senses somehow suddenly sharpened, saw a mouse scurry around the outside of the house and vanish somewhere underneath it, through a hole too small to notice. A couple of jackrabbits fled into the open field beyond the house, heedless of anyone seeing them. The mule seemed uneasy in its stall, stirring, kicking the side of the barn periodically. Even the dog had stopped its happy lolloping, standing close to the back door that led into the kitchen and whining, its ears pricked. The wind slammed down suddenly without warning and whipped up tiny dust devils in the yard. Mary felt the temperature dropping as though someone was pouring cool air down over her like water from a pail. She went into the house at her mother's insistent call, but then she couldn't seem to settle or be still, with Pa and the dog still out there trying to tie things down and make sure everything stayed put, because they knew this. They knew it. A storm was coming. So she slipped out again when Bessie was distracted by the now fractious and whimpering Johnny and stood out in the yard, facing away to the horizon where she had seen the haze form. Except that it was no longer a haze. It was now a black cloud that ate half the sky, a monster, a dragon made of dust which devoured everything in its path. And it was coming. It was coming. It was coming. Pa! Mary screamed and broke from the house towards the barn, desperately searching for her father. Get into the house! Get back! Her father shouted, emerging from the barn and racing towards her. But it was already too late. The wind picked up Mary and lifted her off her feet. She floundered for a moment, scrambling to get back up, and by the time she had managed to get enough traction, the light of the spilling spring sunshine in God's blue heaven had vanished completely. Everything deadened into a brown haze. She felt dust as sharp as ice shards start scouring her face and her hands, and then the storm was overhead and the day turned black around her. She heard her father's voice as though from very far away. She thought she heard the dog yelp. She thought she heard the mule scream. Then she heard another scream, a voice coming from her own throat. No! She stood swaying in the storm, her feet braced and far apart, and she flung out both arms from her shoulders, letting her head fall back to allow that denial to rip into the darkness. And it did. Somehow it did. The air began to clear around her, and then further into the yard, and then the barn, and the house, and a little way beyond into their fields, out toward the boundary of their land, where it ended. It was as though an invisible wall had been raised there. There was this tiny little oasis in which she stood, in which the sun suddenly shone again out of its bright blue sky, and then the light and peace ended in nothing. Outside that invisible wall, which sprang from the ground and rose into the sky as high as it needed to go in order to hold back the dust and the darkness away from Mary's world. Darkness and dust roiled and beat into it, but could not come in. And in the middle of all this she stood, Mary, her arms spread wide, holding hell itself at bay from her and from her family and their home, her face turned up to the sky. Her eyes were closed. She could not open them. Standing there in the middle of the calm eye of the storm she had created, Mary could still feel the dust and the flying debris scouring her face, her hair, her hands. If she had opened her eyes, she would have had them raked from her face by the dust dragon. She could hear her father's voice calling her name. She could feel his hand on her shoulder, trying to push her arm down to her side, but she resisted. She was the shield. She was what was keeping the monster from her hearth, and if she lowered her arms, it would come back in. She stood rooted in her family's land, feet apart, arms outflung, eyes closed, defying the devil himself. She stood there like that for as long as the storm lasted, for hours, in a dream or a trance, letting herself be battered by the storm, keeping it from touching the things and the people she loved. When finally the air beyond the invisible wall she had raised around her home began to lighten and calm, Mary Miller crumpled into a small heap, gasping for air, the only one of the family with dust in her hair and streaked on her face, her lips chapped, her nostrils caked with dirt. It was only when the wall came down around the farmhouse and the yard and they could see the devastation that had been wrought beyond that Mary's family fully realized the extent of what she had done. Asked afterwards, she could not volunteer much. It was dark, she kept repeating. It was dark. It was dark. Val Hall, 2017. It was dark, Mary said, without turning to look at Eddie. I couldn't make myself go to sleep afterwards. I was too afraid of what lay waiting for me out there in that darkness. And then, when they all came and they saw, the first thing they said was that God had watched over our farm, or that the devil had spared it. And more than that, it all had to go somewhere, the dust that passed us by. The Jamisons' jalopy had been utterly buried in it. They had to dig the thing out with shovels, and it never really ran again, not properly. And the dust was piled taller than me around their barn. They had animals die. So did the other neighbors. And then they could come and see our place, and it was clean, swept almost, untouched. And I could understand that maybe they needed someone to blame for that back then. You? They called me the devil's child for a while. Lily Jamison out and told my mother straight out that I wasn't Pa's at all, that the devil had got me on her. People would look at me and with a wary hate. And then the next storm came. Oh, it was not as terrible as this. Nothing was as terrible as this. But it came, and I knew what to do, and I built the walls against it again. And it just got worse because that dust had to go someplace else. Where were you? Oklahoma, Mary said. We stayed there for years after. And then Johnny died. He wasn't yet 5 years old, but he died because he couldn't quite breathe. Too much dust in his little soul. That's when the heart went out of my father. He would fight if he had to, but there was very little to fight for. Johnny dead and me looked at like an abomination half the time, and then importuned like a savior angel the rest of the time when someone needed to stop the dust. So we left Oklahoma in the end, after another couple of years of trying to gouge a harvest out of the unforgiving earth. We left Johnny's bones back there. She paused. Buried, sweet Johnny, in the dust, in the dark. You moved out? We drifted here and there. It's like we lost our roots when we pulled out of the dust. Couldn't settle anywhere, no how. Laurie and Louisa got married, eventually moved away. But my reputation followed me. Nobody would have me, not the devil girl. You didn't stay the devil girl, Eddie said. No, once we moved out of places where the preachers could point fingers at me, Mary said with a mirthless little smile. They started calling me the Shield back then at some point. Superhero instead of devil, Eddie said. Mary nodded. Especially if I could be somewhere on someone's land and spare their world from the whirlwind, and then people began to know about it as the word spread, and began to offer to pay me for doing it. So I left home too and traveled around where the winds were, standing against them. But I could never again go to sleep in the dark. Always a lantern or a candle or eventually a nightlight. Always. There were voices in the dark, and I didn't want to hear them again. But you said you went to the eclipse, Eddie said, up north, before. Yes, I had friends by that time, Mary said, but her voice was joyless at the memory. I had friends, and they wanted to go, so I drifted along with them. I went where the wind blew me, as ever. But oh, in that darkness. She shivered, hunching her shoulders. I don't think they believed me before, but they found out. They found out when the total darkness came. I screamed and whimpered. I had to be held, restrained. They must have thought I was insane. But the voices, the voices, the voices! I could hear the voices, and they were telling me... What, Mary? Eddie said gently. Why do the voices frighten you so? Mary turned to look at him, her eyes unfocused, not really seeing him at all, but gazing straight through him and somewhere into the distance. Death, she said. I know when I'm going to die, and it's going to be alone. Eddie reached out and gripped her arm. Never, he said. Never alone. Not while there's a light I can make shine for you in the night. It's starting, someone said in an excited voice. You should be able to see something. Can you see? Use the glasses. The glasses. But the glasses weren't quite necessary. Eddie and Mary stood surrounded by light that changed, that faded from bright sunshine into something more brittle, more silvery, something like the dead white light of a full moon, the shadows graying and blending with the things that had cast them. The shadows which turned into crescents on the ground as people pointed and exclaimed, some taking pictures with their phone cameras. Mary wouldn't look up, her eclipse glasses still dangling from her fingertips. Eddie gave her shoulder another squeeze. It's all right, he said. This is it. This is as dark as it's going to get out here. No dust, no storm, no darkness falling. People died back then, back on Black Sunday, you know, Mary said, her voice flat and inflectionless. People went blind. Animals were buried alive. And I heard tell after, there was electricity in the air. People touched fences and got scorched by lightning sparking from them. And people said after they couldn't see. You can see now, Eddie said. Look up. You can see now. She didn't respond, not quite, but her hand trembled, and Eddie took that as a sign. He helped her lift the cardboard glasses up to her face, folded them back around her ears, gently touched her hair. Look up, he said. Look at the dragon. Look him in the eye. And Mary did, very slowly, raising her face to the sky. She stood very still for a long moment, gazing up to where a pallid sun hung without looking as though it had been touched by the shadow of the moon, but somehow with all its warmth leached away, and a small, slow smile crept onto her face. It's beautiful, she whispered at last. And look, it's starting to come back now. I can see the sun coming back. The sun always comes back, Eddie said. The Shield, Mary Miller, turned to face him, reaching up to remove the eclipse glasses. Eddie was not surprised in the least to see the tears standing in her eyes. Thank you for that, she said. I don't think I would have looked. Without you there, I would never have seen. She paused. I have been alone for so long, she said, and she sounded fierce about it. I never married, you know. I never had children of my own. I was too busy standing against hurricanes, against tornadoes, against typhoons. The people came to me and said, save this place or that place, and I stood against the wind there where they showed me to stand. And the wind and the darkness never won. But I never stopped being afraid of them. And it didn't seem fair to inflict that on a man, on children. So I stayed alone, going where I needed to go. She paused, giving Eddie a curious side glance from the corner of her eye, looking almost guilty. I tried to do good, you know. They thought if I could stop the winds, I could make them. They tried to make me create a storm, make the winds blow. They tried to turn me into a weapon, but I always knew that what I did came from God and not from his enemy. I would never do anything to harm another creature. I know, Eddie said softly. I know. He recalled Mary's arrival at Valhall. It was still not quite 2 full years ago now. She had come reluctantly, almost against her will, and only after it had become obvious that she could no longer safely live by herself. After 2 falls, one of which very nearly shattered her shoulder and left her hospitalized for a while. But she had been independent, fiercely independent, and accepting Valhall as her final destination had been bitter for her. She had made no friends since she had got here. She had told nobody about herself. It had taken the threat of a return to darkness, which was the only thing she feared, for her to break. "It will be all right now," Eddie said. "It will be all right. Shall we go back in and I can get you a cup of tea?" He looked around to where the shadows were sharpening steadily back into those of a normal sunny summer day and gestured with his hand to where groups of people were starting to break away and drift back towards the house. A couple of orderlies darted about the lawn, carting the wicker chairs which had been taken out there for the comfort of those who could not stand for long back to the porch where they belonged. "There will still be nights from here on," Eddie said to Mary, turning to look back at her. "But now you know the sun returns, and there will be someone there in the morning. Remember, you're not the devil's spawn. You're a superhero. You're here. You're why Valhall exists. We were made to keep the light on for you, even in the darkness of the belly of the dust dragon. And you can tell me all about the dust dragon now, because I think you have finally slain him. You can turn him back into the dust from which he came, watch him crumble. You are the shield, and you have won." Mary bowed her head and gazed down at the toes of her slippers for a moment. But when she looked up again to meet Eddie's eyes, her own had kindled into a luminous glow that made Eddie's heart glad. "The shield," Mary Miller said, "would be glad of a cup of tea." Eddie offered his arm, as any gentleman would to a great lady, and they walked slowly back to Valhall in the sunshine. Well, those will be the stories, some of the stories that I've been writing. I'm going to put something up on the comment section for those of you who are still here, to have you a bit of information. But that's a sample of what I'm writing, and that's a sample of the fantasy which nobody wants to know about out in the other world. Is this better now? I sincerely hope that you guys enjoyed this. And quite possibly it would be something that I might do again. If you do go down to the Patreon, what I might put up there is, when I started writing this thing, I wrote a Wikipedia entry for Valhall. I basically wrote up a history of Wikipedia for Valhall, and I might basically put that up as an entry to my Patreon for those who might wish to go there. I've been startled by some of the stories that have come out in this, by the power of some of the stories that have come out of this. I believe that the true power of fantasy is to tell the absolute truth. And that's what I've been trying to do all my life. So, now you see a hint of what I've been doing with myself over the last couple of months. I realize it's been almost an hour, and I'm happy to see that people have been here listening to me. Please let me know if you like these things. I'm very excited about this particular project, and I hope that these stories have given you a hint of why. My thanks to my husband, who gave me the push, and to the origami man, who gave me the inspiration. I will bid you farewell for now, and maybe I'll be back again soon. Thank you for being here.